The storm hammered the cabin roof like rifle fire, each raindrop a bullet against the silence that had swallowed the Lark homestead whole. 13-year-old Ruth sat on the rough wooden floor knees, pulled tight to her chest, clutching a picture frame whose glass had spiderwebbed when she dropped it 3 hours earlier during the chaos that tore her world apart. Through the fractured surface, she could still see their faces. Mama's gentle smile, 8-year-old Bess's gap-toothed grin, 6-year-old Eli's mischievous eyes that always sparkled with some secret joke. The photograph had been taken last spring at the church social back, when their biggest worry was whether the corn would grow tall enough to see them through winter. They took my family away. She whispered to the empty rooms, her voice breaking like the glass in her trembling hands. The words seemed to echo off the overturned furniture and scattered belongings, mixing with the drumbeat of rain and the distant rumble of thunder that promised the storm was far from finished. The men had come at sunset, their faces hidden behind blood-red kerchiefs, moving with the practiced efficiency of wolves hunting in a pack. Ruth had been gathering eggs from the henhouse when she heard her mother's terrified scream, followed by the crash of furniture and Bess's high-pitched crying that cut through the evening air like a blade. She'd hidden in the root cellar, watching through a crack in the floorboards as they ransacked her home with methodical brutality. The leader, a man with pale, dead eyes and scarred knuckles that spoke of violence as a way of life, had grabbed Leah by her auburn hair and demanded answers about something he called the deed. "I don't know what you mean," her mother had gasped, trying desperately to shield Bess and Eli behind her worn calico dress. "Don't play ignorant with me, woman. Your husband borrowed money from Mr. McKinn, used this land as collateral. Payments due, and we're here to collect. Thomas never borrowed from anyone." Leah had protested, her voice shaking with fear and confusion. "This land is ours free and clear. We have the papers." The scarred man's laugh had been like breaking bones. "Then show me these papers. Right now." When Leah couldn't produce documents she'd never seen, when she stammered that Thomas handled all such matters, they'd bound her hands with rope and dragged her toward the door. Bess had screamed when rough hands seized her small body, and little Eli had cried for Papa, not understanding that Thomas Lark had been missing for over a week, vanished after taking dangerous work at the Silver Spur mine to pay bills that kept mounting like storm clouds. Ruth had watched in helpless horror as they loaded her family into a freight wagon bearing the letters RMK, painted in faded black across its weathered sides. The last thing she'd seen before they disappeared into the growing darkness was Eli's small hand pressed against the wagon's rear slats, reaching toward home like a drowning child reaching for the surface. Now she sat alone in the ruins of her childhood, listening to the storm rage overhead and wondering if she'd ever see sunrise again. The cabin door hung slightly ajar where the intruders had left it, rain seeping across the threshold in dark fingers that seemed to be reaching for her with malevolent purpose. Every shadow looked like an enemy, every sound like approaching death. A shadow filled the doorway, and Ruth's breath caught in her throat like a trapped bird. The man who stepped inside was tall and broad-shouldered, with long black hair that streamed water from the storm outside. He wore a fringed buckskin coat darkened by rain and carried a Winchester rifle with the easy familiarity of someone who'd learned to survive by his weapons. Most striking was the ceremonial eagle feather headdress. He wore a crown of honor that marked him as a warrior among the northern Cheyenne. Ruth pressed herself against the wall, still clutching her broken picture frame like a shield against the unknown. Stories about the Cheyenne circulated among the settlers, some fearful tales of savage raids, others speaking of honor and dignity among the tribes. She'd never been this close to one of their warriors, never looked into eyes that held such quiet strength tempered by profound sadness. "You are Thomas Lark's daughter." He said, his English careful but clear, each word chosen with precision. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, delivered with gentle certainty. Ruth's voice emerged as barely a whisper. "Have you come to kill me?" Something shifted in his dark eyes, recognition perhaps, or understanding, of the terror that had become her constant companion since the world exploded into violence and loss. He removed his headdress with reverent care, hanging it on a wooden peg near the door before crouching down several feet away, making himself less imposing to the frightened child. "I am Hyamovi of the northern Cheyenne," he said gently, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed, but tempered with compassion. "I do not make war on children. I heard the gunfire from miles away, saw the smoke rising from your chimney like a signal fire. Where is your family?" The simple question shattered what remained of Ruth's composure, like glass striking stone. Words tumbled out between desperate gasps, years of careful upbringing, abandoned in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. Gone, taken by men with red kerchiefs like devils from hell itself. They grabbed Mama and Bess, and Eli threw them in a wagon like sacks of grain bound for market. "Papa's been missing for over a week, and I don't know if he's alive or dead, and I can't save anyone because I'm just a child, and they have guns and horses and—" "Peace, little sister." Hyamovi's voice carried quiet authority that seemed to calm the very air around them, like the eye of a hurricane where everything stood still despite the chaos spinning beyond. "You are not alone now. The spirits have brought us together for a purpose." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, beaded pouch worn smooth by countless touches and handling that spoke of years of careful preservation. For a moment, deep pain flickered across his weathered features, like lightning illuminating a night sky, revealing depths of loss that matched her own. "My wife Ayana made this before she was taken from me in the troubles between our peoples," he said softly, his fingers tracing the intricate beadwork with infinite tenderness. "I carry it to remember that loss breeds more loss, like fire spreading through dry grass, until someone chooses to stand against the flames and say, 'Enough.'" Ruth studied his face, recognizing something in his eyes that matched her own, and the hollow look of someone who had lost everything that gave life meaning, yet somehow found the strength to continue breathing, walking, fighting for something larger than themselves. "Why would you help me?" she whispered, her voice small against the vastness of her despair. Hyamovi was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rain hammer against the cabin walls and the wind howl through the gaps where violence had damaged the structure that had once been her sanctuary. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of personal conviction, forged in fire and tempered by suffering that had either broken him or made him stronger. Because justice flows like water, it recognizes no boundaries of skin color, only the landscape of the heart. The men who took your family are the same breed who destroy without honor, whether they prey on Cheyenne children or white ones. They are wolves who have forgotten that even wolves have laws. This I cannot allow to continue while I still draw breath. Thunder crashed overhead like the sound of mountains falling, and suddenly Hyamovi's entire body went rigid with the alertness of a predator sensing danger. Through the broken window came the drumbeat of approaching horses, their hooves splashing through mud and standing water with urgent purpose that spoke of men on deadly business. "They return," he said, his voice sharp as steel as he grabbed his rifle and checked the action with movements born of long practice. Perhaps they realized they left a witness. Ruth scrambled to her feet as riders materialized from the storm like demons emerging from hell itself. 4 men in rain slicker's red kerchiefs pulled up over their faces like masks of death. The leader raised his hand, and they spread out around the cabin with the practiced coordination of hunters surrounding wounded prey that had nowhere left to run. "Girl!" the scarred man shouted over the howling wind and driving rain, his voice carrying across the storm with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed through fear. "We know you're hiding in there like a rabbit in a hole. Come out peaceful-like, and maybe we'll make this quick and painless." Hyamovi pressed himself against the wall beside the shattered window, checking his ammunition with swift, sure movements that spoke of countless battles survived through preparation and skill. How many rounds have seen battle today?" He murmured to his Winchester, speaking to the weapon like an old friend who had shared both triumph and tragedy. The first shot exploded through the window in a shower of glass and splinters, the bullet punching through Ruth's picture frame and completely destroying what remained of the protective glass. The photograph of her family fluttered to the floor like a dying butterfly landing face up, so their smiling faces seemed to be looking at her with expressions that might have been accusation or encouragement. "That next bullet finds your heart unless you show yourself." The leader called out his voice, carrying the casual cruelty of a man who enjoyed his work and took pride in the fear he could instill with nothing more than words and the promise of violence. Hyamovi overturned the heavy kitchen table, creating a makeshift barricade that offered some protection from the murderous crossfire that was sure to follow. "Back door," he whispered urgently to Ruth, his voice barely audible over the storm's fury. "When I give the word, you run for those cottonwoods by the creek. Don't look back no matter what sounds you hear behind you, no matter what your heart tells you about leaving me to face them alone." More shots peppered the cabin walls, sending deadly splinters flying through the air like wooden bullets that could kill as surely as lead. Ruth crawled across the floor on her belly, snatching up the damaged photograph as lead death whistled overhead, the familiar room transformed into a battlefield where childhood had come to die in fire and blood. Now, Hyamovi kicked open the back door with explosive force and shoved Ruth into the teeth of the storm, where rain struck her face like cold needles and wind threatened to knock her from her feet. She stumbled through ankle-deep mud that tried to hold her like quicksand rain, blinding her as she ran toward the line of cottonwood trees that stood like ghostly sentinels in the darkness, their branches reaching toward the storm-torn sky like the arms of supplicants begging heaven for mercy. Behind her, she could hear Hyamovi's rifle beginning its deadly conversation with the attackers, each shot sharp and purposeful, answered by the deeper boom of pistols and the splintering of wood as bullets found their marks in everything, except the warrior, who moved like smoke through the chaos. She'd almost reached the safety of the trees when iron fingers grabbed her braid, yanking her backward with such violence that stars exploded across her vision, and pain shot through her scalp like fire. One of the riders had circled around during the gun battle, cutting off her escape route with the patience of a predator who understood the value of positioning. "Got the little wildcat," he yelled triumphantly to his companions, his voice cutting through the storm with savage satisfaction. Ruth clawed desperately at his grip, her feet sliding treacherously in the slick mud that offered no purchase for escape. The man raised his free hand to strike her senseless when a war club materialized from the storm darkness, connecting with his wrist in a sound like breaking kindling that was followed immediately by his scream of pain and surprise. Hyamovi grabbed Ruth's hand and pulled her toward Willow Creek, which had become a torrential river, swollen with storm runoff that carried debris, uprooted trees, and the promise of death to anyone foolish enough to challenge its current. Into the water. Stay low and trust the current to hide us. They slid down the muddy bank into water so cold it drove the breath from their lungs like a physical blow, shocking their systems and making every muscle contract in protest. The current immediately tried to sweep them downstream toward the rocks that jutted from the water like teeth, but Hyamovi pulled her under the natural shelter of a fallen cottonwood, whose massive root system created a cave-like hiding place that offered protection from both bullets and observation. "Can't see them," one of the riders shouted from above his voice, nearly lost in the storm's fury as he tried to peer through the curtain of rain and darkness that had swallowed their quarry. "Burn everything," the leader commanded, with vicious satisfaction, his words carrying clearly over the water. "If we can't deliver the girl to McKinn, we'll make sure there's nothing left worth coming back to. Let the whole place burn as a message to anyone else who thinks they can stand against us." Through the curtain of rain and rushing water, Ruth watched her childhood home become a funeral pyre as one of the attackers threw a lit torch through the shattered window. Flames began licking hungrily at the walls, despite the storm's best efforts to extinguish them, consuming everything that had ever mattered to her: furniture built by her father's hands, quilts sewn by her mother during long winter evenings, toys carved for Bess and Eli during happier times when the future seemed bright with promise. "My home." She whispered the words, lost in the roar of wind and water and the crackling of flames consuming her past. Hayamovi's hand found her shoulder, steadying her against both the current and her overwhelming despair that threatened to drag her under more surely than the swirling water. "Home lives in the heart, little sister, not in wood and stone. When your family is safe, we will build you another that will stand for generations." They crouched in the freezing water while destruction raged above them, listening to the sounds of systematic vandalism and casual cruelty as the raiders completed their work with the thoroughness of professionals who took pride in leaving nothing behind. Finally, the hoofbeats faded into the storm, but not before Ruth heard words that would haunt her dreams for years to come. "Tell McKinn the girl slipped through our fingers like water. He's not going to be pleased about losing his leverage, but at least we sent a message that'll keep other folks from getting ideas about crossing him." When silence returned, except for the storm and the crackling of flames consuming her past, Hayamovi helped Ruth struggle up the treacherous bank, both of them shivering from cold and shock. Everything she'd ever known lay in smoking ruins, her entire life reduced to ash and bitter memory in the space of a few terrible hours that had transformed her from a protected child into a refugee, with nothing left but the clothes on her back and the damaged photograph clutched in her fist. "Art McKinn." She repeated the name, tasting like poison on her tongue, syllables that carried the weight of pure evil. "Who is McKinn?" "A man who believes money gives him the right to take whatever catches his fancy." Hayamovi replied grimly, his voice carrying the weight of personal knowledge earned through bitter experience. "Randall McKinn owns the Silver Spur mine where your father took work. If he sent men for your family, that's where they'll be taken if they're still alive." In the distance, two horses grazed nervously near the tree line, their riders apparently thrown during the chaotic gun battle that had ended with more violence than either side had anticipated. Hayamovi approached them with infinite patience, speaking soft words in Cheyenne until they allowed him to gather their reins with gentle hands that had known both creation and destruction. He helped Ruth onto the smaller mare, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she gripped the saddle horn and tried to process the enormity of what had happened to her world. The damaged photograph was still clutched in her fist, her family's faces barely visible through the network of cracks that looked like tears frozen in glass, a map of heartbreak that would never fully heal. "I give you my sacred word, Ruth Lark," Hayamovi said as he mounted the larger horse, his voice carrying the authority of unbreakable vows that bound his soul to hers in common cause. "On my honor as a warrior, on the memory of my beloved wife, who watches from the spirit world, I will help you find your family. The men who committed this evil will answer for their crimes in this world or the next." As they rode away from the glowing ruins of her former life, Ruth looked back one final time at what had been her entire universe only hours before. The storm was beginning to clear along the eastern horizon, and she could see the first stars appearing between the dispersing clouds like distant promises that dawn might actually come again, bringing with it the possibility of justice and redemption. "Do you truly believe we can save them?" she asked, her voice small against the vastness of the night and the seeming impossibility of the task before them. Hayamovi's response carried across the prairie wind with absolute certainty that brooked no argument with fate or circumstance. "We will save them, little sister, or we will die in the attempt. Honor allows no other choice for those who would call themselves human." They rode through the remainder of the night toward an uncertain dawn, two unlikely allies, bound by grief and driven by the same desperate hope that somewhere in the dangerous territory ahead, justice might still be possible for those brave enough to seek it with their lives as the wager. Dawn found them at Willow Springs Trading Post, a cluster of weathered buildings arranged around a natural spring, like pilgrims gathering at a shrine. The settlement served as the only outpost of civilization for 50 miles in any direction, a place where travelers could find supplies, shelter, and sometimes healing for both body and spirit. Smoke rose from several chimneys, and the sound of hammering indicated that the blacksmith was already at work despite the early hour. Dr. Greta Ansel emerged from the trading post's infirmary. As they dismounted, her graying hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, her German accent still thick as cream after 23 years on the frontier. She was a widow who had transformed her grief over losing her husband to cholera into a calling to heal others, her medical bag never far from her capable hands, and her sharp eyes missing nothing that might indicate suffering in need of attention. "Mein Gott in Himmel," she exclaimed, taking in Ruth's bedraggled condition and the stoic warrior beside her, who looked like he'd been through several battles in the space of a single night. "What terrible thing has happened to this child?" Armed men took her family. Hyamovi explained simply his words, carrying the weight of tragedy that needed no embellishment. "We seek information about the Silver Spur mine and its operations, and any news of Thomas Lark." Dr. Ansel ushered them into her clean, herb-scented infirmary, where the smell of carbolic acid and dried medicines created an atmosphere of competent care that spoke of years spent mending what violence and accident had broken. As she began cleaning the splinters and cuts from Ruth's palms with gentle efficiency, the girl found herself telling the story again, and the raid, the kidnapping, the systematic destruction of everything she'd ever known or loved. "Your father, Thomas Lark," Dr. Ansel murmured thoughtfully as she dabbed iodine on a particularly deep puncture wound that drew a sharp intake of breath from her patient. "Yeah, he stopped here 8 days ago on his way to the Silver Spur. He seemed, how do you say, deeply troubled. Spoke of mounting debts, of taking dangerous work with explosives to provide for his family." What kind of dangerous work? Hyamovi pressed his warrior's instincts, picking up nuances that others might miss. "Powder man. Handling the dynamite for blasting new mine shafts. It pays triple the normal wage because—" She glanced meaningfully at Ruth and left the sentence unfinished. But the implication hung in the air like smoke. "Because men die doing it regularly." Ruth completed quietly, her voice carrying a maturity that had been forced upon her by circumstances beyond her control. She'd overheard enough whispered conversations among mining families to understand the grim mathematics of underground work, where profit margins were calculated in human lives. Dr. Ansel nodded reluctantly, her expression grave, with professional knowledge of what such work entailed. "The Silver Spur has suffered an unusual number of accidents lately. More than seems natural even for such hazardous work. Explosions, cave-ins, poisoned air that kills slowly. Always when men begin asking inconvenient questions about working conditions or pay. The implications were clear without being spoken aloud. McKinn's operation wasn't just dangerous, it was deliberately deadly when it served his purposes. Men who asked too many questions or demanded fair treatment had accidents that eliminated both problems and potential witnesses to whatever was really happening at the Silver Spur mine. They would need to reach Crow's Landing, the nearest settlement, with any pretense of law enforcement. Dr. Ansel warned them about the 20-mile journey across territory that was known to harbor outlaws, claim jumpers, and worse, but provided them with supplies and detailed directions to avoid the worst of the Badlands, where decent people traveled only in large groups with plenty of ammunition. The trail to Crow's Landing led across rolling prairie that stretched to every horizon, broken by occasional stands of cottonwood trees that marked the courses of seasonal streams. Under different circumstances, Ruth might have found the landscape beautiful in its vast emptiness. But now every ridge could hide enemies. Every shadow might conceal death, waiting with patient malevolence. They reached the Platte River by midday, only to find their path blocked by floodwaters from the previous night's storm. The ferry crossing had been damaged, its wooden platform half submerged and listing at an angle that made it unusable. The swollen river ran fast and dangerous, carrying debris that could crush a swimmer or drag them under with relentless current. "Can you swim?" Hyamovi asked Ruth, studying the treacherous water with the eye of someone who'd learned to read natural dangers as a survival skill. She nodded, though her stomach clenched with instinctive fear at the sight of the churning brown water. "Papa taught me in Miller's Creek, but that was just a gentle stream compared to this monster. This river runs deep and fast, and the water will be cold enough to stop your heart if panic takes you." Hyamovi warned with the matter-of-fact tone of someone explaining a simple but deadly reality. "If fear overwhelms you, the current will carry you away like a leaf, and I won't be able to save you. I'll swim a rope across and secure it. Hold tight with both hands and trust me to pull you to safety." Ruth watched from the muddy bank as Hyamovi stripped to his buckskin pants and dove into the roiling water, with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned swimming as a survival skill rather than recreation. The current immediately tried to sweep him downstream toward the rocks that jutted from the water like broken teeth, but he was a powerful swimmer who'd learned his skills in the mighty Yellowstone River as a boy, understanding how to work with the flow instead of fighting it. He angled upstream while swimming hard across, letting the current carry him in a diagonal line toward the opposite bank, where a sturdy cottonwood offered an anchor point. The crossing took longer than expected, and Ruth found herself holding her breath as Hyamovi's head disappeared and reappeared in the choppy water, sometimes lost for heart-stopping moments before surfacing again with steady, powerful strokes. When he finally hauled himself onto the far shore and secured the rope around the cottonwood's trunk, Ruth said a desperate prayer to whatever gods might be listening and waded into the torrent. The shock of the cold water drove every bit of breath from her lungs, and panic rose in her throat like bile as the current slammed into her with the force of a runaway horse trying to tear her loose from the rope and drag her into the churning brown foam where death waited with patient inevitability. "Ruth." Hyamovi's voice cut through her terror like a blade through darkness. "Stop fighting the river. Let it carry you while I pull work with the water, not against it." She forced herself to stop struggling against the inevitable, to trust the rope and the strength of the man, hauling her toward salvation, one steady pull at a time. The crossing became a nightmare of cold water filling her nose and mouth, of current trying to twist her body into positions that would break the rope's hold of rocks and debris, striking her legs and arms as the river tried to claim another victim. When her feet finally touched solid ground on the far shore, she collapsed on the bank like a landed fish, coughing up muddy water and shaking with cold and exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. But she was alive, and the river hadn't claimed her despite its best efforts. Hyamovi wrapped her in his coat, rubbing warmth back into her arms with brisk efficiency, while checking her for injuries that might need immediate attention. "You did well, little sister. The river tests every soul who dares to cross it. You passed that test with honor." That night, they camped on the open prairie under a vast dome of stars, so brilliant they seemed close enough to pluck like flowers from heaven's garden. Hyamovi built a small fire from buffalo chips and dried grass, the flames dancing in the constant wind that swept across the grassland like the breath of sleeping giants, carrying scents of sage and wild roses and the promise of weather changes that could bring either blessing or catastrophe. Ruth sat wrapped in a blanket, still clutching her damaged photograph, with fierce protectiveness. In the flickering firelight, her family's faces seemed to move and shift, almost alive enough to speak words of comfort or encouragement to the daughter and sister who was risking everything to bring them home. "Tell me about your wife," she said quietly, sensing that shared grief might bind their unlikely alliance more strongly than mere convenience or temporary common cause. Hyamovi was silent for so long. She wondered if he'd chosen not to answer, perhaps finding the memories too painful to revisit in the presence of someone he barely knew. When he finally spoke, His voice carried the weight of love, transformed into eternal sorrow that would never fully heal. Ayana. The name meant eternal blossom in our tongue, and she lived up to its promise, always growing, always changing, beautiful in every season of her life, like the prairie itself. He touched the beaded pouch at his belt with infinite tenderness, as if the simple gesture could bridge the gap between the living and the dead. She made this for me during our last winter together, before the soldiers came with their promises and ultimatums that were really just different ways of saying the same thing. How did you lose her? Disease brought by those who promised to help us. Hunger on the reservation where they penned us like livestock and told us it was for our own good. The slow death that comes when a proud people are caged and told to forget everything that made them who they were. His hands clenched into fists that spoke of rage, held barely in check by years of forced self-control. But also men like McKinn, who see suffering as an opportunity to profit from desperation, who turn human misery into gold that jingles in their pockets. A wolf's howl drifted across the prairie darkness, answered by another voice, then another, until an entire pack seemed to be announcing their presence to the night, with voices that spoke of hunger and the eternal hunt. Ruth pressed closer to their small fire as yellow eyes began reflecting the flames from the darkness beyond their circle of light, appearing and disappearing like malevolent stars. They smell our horses, Hayamovi said calmly, picking up a burning branch from the fire and waving it toward the nearest pair of predatory eyes that watched them with the patience of creatures who understood that all flesh eventually became food for those willing to wait. The pack began circling their camp with intelligent coordination shadows, moving through the tall grass like living darkness that flowed around obstacles and reformed on the other side. Ruth could hear them panting the soft click of claws on stone, the whisper of bodies moving through vegetation with the deadly grace of apex predators who had refined their hunting skills over countless generations. When one crept close enough that she could see its silver-gray fur in detail and count the gleam of teeth in its half-open mouth, she grabbed her own burning stick and hurled it with all her strength. The wolf yelped and bounded away in surprise, and the rest of the pack melted back into the darkness like smoke, their howls fading into the distance as they sought easier prey than humans armed with fire and determination. You learn quickly, Hayamovi observed with obvious approval. Fear can be useful if you don't let it paralyze your ability to act when action is required. As their fire burned down to glowing embers that painted their faces in shades of red and gold, Ruth found herself staring up at the infinite field of stars, each point of light a reminder of how small and vulnerable they were in the vastness of creation, yet also proof that even the smallest light could shine across impossible distances. Do you truly believe we can bring them back? She asked, her voice barely audible over the wind's constant whisper. My family, I mean. Sometimes it feels like hoping for the impossible, like trying to catch falling stars in my bare hands. Hayamovi's answer came with the solemnity of a sacred vow that bound his soul to purposes larger than personal survival. Among my people, a man's word is his bond with the spirit world itself. When I make a promise on my honor, I stake everything I am on keeping it even unto death. I have given you my word, Ruth Lark. I will bring your family home safely, or I will die in the attempt, and my spirit will continue the fight, even after my body falls. The wind whispered through the grass, with the sound of ancient secrets carrying the scent of sage and the promise of trials yet to come that would test every ounce of strength and courage they possessed. But for the first time since the raid, Ruth felt something besides despair taking root in her chest, hope fragile as a candle flame, but burning steadier with each passing moment, fed by the quiet certainty in Hayamovi's voice and the growing conviction that some fights were worth any sacrifice. Crow's Landing squatted beside Willow Creek, like a collection of sun-bleached bones, its handful of buildings arranged along a single dusty street that had seen far better years. A saloon with bat-wing doors, a general store with fly-specked windows, a blacksmith shop that rang with the sound of hammer on anvil, and the territorial marshal's office comprised the beating heart of what passed for law and civilization in this corner of Wyoming Territory. The town had the weary look of a place that had given up on dreams of prosperity and settled for mere survival, where hope had been worn down by too many failed schemes and broken promises. Paint peeled from building facades. Boardwalks sagged under the weight of accumulated disappointment, and the few residents visible on the street moved with the defeated shuffle of people who'd learned not to expect much from life. As Ruth and Hyamovi rode slowly down the main street, conversations died away, and heads turned to follow their progress with expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Ruth could feel the weight of dozens of eyes measuring them, evaluating whether they represented opportunity threat or simple entertainment in a place where excitement was scarce and usually bloody. Marshal Harlan Boone emerged from his office as they dismounted a heavy-set man whose badge looked tarnished by more than weather and time. His pale eyes fixed on Hyamovi with the kind of suspicion that had become second nature over years of frontier authority, mixed with the particular hatred that some men reserved for those they considered beneath them in the grand hierarchy of race and station. "Well, well." He drawled his voice, carrying the casual menace of a man accustomed to having his smallest words obeyed without question or delay. "What do we have here? A redskin and a—" His gaze shifted to Ruth, and something flickered in his expression, recognition perhaps, or calculation of how this unexpected arrival might affect his carefully maintained balance of power and profit. "You're the Lark girl, aren't you?" He continued, his tone taking on a false note of concern that fooled no one. "Heard there was some kind of trouble out at your family's place. Shame about that. These are dangerous times for folks living alone on the frontier." "They took my family," Ruth said, fighting to keep her voice level despite the rage building in her chest, like steam in a boiler under too much pressure. "Armed men with red kerchiefs attacked our home last night, burned it to the ground, and kidnapped my mother and brother and sister like they were livestock to be sold at market." Boone stepped closer, and Ruth caught the unmistakable smell of whiskey on his breath, despite the early hour. Not the social drinking of a man enjoying life's pleasures, but the desperate consumption of someone trying to drown memories or quiet a guilty conscience. His proximity felt threatening, invasive, like a predator, testing potential prey for signs of weakness. "Now that's a mighty serious accusation, little missy," he said with false concern that masked something darker beneath the surface. "You absolutely certain you didn't just imagine some of those details in all the excitement? Young girls can get confused when they're scared, and fear has a way of making shadows look like monsters." Ruth's hands clenched into fists at the condescending dismissal, anger overriding caution as she faced down a man who clearly had no intention of helping her find justice. "I saw them load my family into a freight wagon marked with the letters RMK. They weren't figments of my imagination. They were real men committing real crimes, and you're going to help me bring them to justice, or I'll find someone who will be RMK, you say?" Boone's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, and Ruth caught a flash of something that might have been worry or fear. That's mighty specific for a girl who was supposedly cowering in terror while her world burned down around her ears. Hyamovi placed a calming hand on Ruth's shoulder, sensing the dangerous direction of the conversation and the underlying currents of corruption and complicity that flowed beneath the surface like poisoned water. "We seek only justice, Marshal. Surely the territorial law exists to protect innocent families from such violence." "The law." Boone interrupted his hand, drifting toward the gun at his hip with practiced casualness. "Doesn't take kindly to Indians stirring up trouble in decent towns. Matter of fact, I'm thinking you might want to consider moving along before the local folks start getting nervous about having your kind around, asking questions that might upset the natural order of things. Before anyone could respond to the barely veiled threat, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats shattered the tense standoff like a stone through glass. 3 riders burst around the corner at full gallop, their faces covered by crimson kerchiefs, their weapons already drawn and ready for violence that had found them in the heart of civilization itself. Ruth's blood turned to ice as she recognized the pale, merciless eyes of their leader and the same man who had orchestrated the destruction of her world and now pursued her with the relentless determination of a hunter who'd been denied his prize. "It's them!" she screamed, her voice carrying across the dusty street with piercing clarity. The first bullet kicked up dust inches from her feet as Hayamovi tackled her sideways, rolling them both behind a wooden water trough with reflexes honed by years of combat. More shots followed in rapid succession, splintering the wood and sending water cascading into the dusty street in streams that turned the ground to treacherous mud. To Ruth's horror and disbelief, she saw Marshal Boone draw his own weapon, but instead of aiming at the attacking riders who were filling the street with lead and terror, he was targeting Hayamovi with deliberate precision that spoke of predetermined purpose rather than confused reaction. "Get away from that girl, you savage!" Boone shouted over the chaos of gunfire, his words revealing the depth of his corruption and complicity in whatever McKinn's operation represented. Hayamovi pushed Ruth toward the open doorway of the saddler's shop, his voice cutting through the chaos with urgent command. "Inside, get to cover and stay down." She stumbled through the entrance as one of the mounted attackers wheeled his horse around the water trough, his pistol trained on the warrior with deadly intent. Hayamovi moved like flowing water, sidestepping the charge at the last possible second, and grabbing the rider's leg, using the man's own momentum to drag him from his saddle in a bone-jarring crash that sent both combatants rolling across the dusty ground. They hit the earth hard and immediately began fighting with desperate fury, rolling in the dust, while fists and elbows connected with sickening thuds that spoke of serious damage being inflicted on both sides. Ruth watched through the shop window as Hayamovi drove his elbow into his opponent's ribs, followed by a knee to the solar plexus that left the man gasping and retching in the dirt. The second rider approached from the left, his horse dancing nervously as he tried to line up a clear shot through the chaos of combat and civilian panic. Ruth looked around frantically for anything that might help shift the odds in their favor and spotted a leather awl on the saddler's workbench, not much of a weapon, but sharp enough to matter if properly employed. She hurled it with every ounce of strength she possessed, her desperate throw guided more by hope than skill. The tool struck the horse's flank, not hard enough to cause serious injury, but sufficient to startle the animal into bucking wildly with startled pain and confusion. The rider's shot went wide as he fought to stay mounted, his weapon spinning away into the dust where it could no longer threaten anyone. The third attacker dismounted and came through the shop's front door like an avenging demon, his gun raised, and murder blazing in his eyes like unholy fire. Ruth threw herself behind the workbench as his pistol boomed in the confined space, filling the air with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the whistle of flying splinters that could blind or kill with equal efficiency. She grabbed a shard of glass from the window, shattered by stray bullets, wrapping part of her torn dress around it to protect her palm while creating an improvised weapon that might give her a chance against superior force. When the gunman rounded the workbench, expecting to find a cowering child, Ruth slashed at his gun hand with desperate fury born of absolute necessity. He roared in pain, and surprise blood streaming from the gash across his knuckles as his weapon clattered to the floor in a percussion of metal on wood. The sight of his own blood seemed to enrage him further, transforming pain into fury, and he lunged for Ruth with hands that promised strangulation as the quickest end to his humiliation. A new voice suddenly cut through the chaos like a blade through silk, sharp, educated, and decidedly female in a way that commanded attention even in the midst of deadly violence. "Marshal Boone," the voice declared with ringing authority that brooked no argument. "There are witnesses here who saw these men attack first, If you're going to arrest anyone, it should be them for assault and attempted murder in broad daylight, on a public street. Through the broken window, Ruth could see a woman in her 30s standing on the boardwalk, her brown hair pinned back with severe precision, holding a small notebook and pencil like weapons of their own. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed in a world that rarely listened to female voices, her posture speaking of education and authority that transcended the rough frontier setting. Miriam Shaw. The woman continued addressing the gathering crowd, rather than Boone, directly, her voice carrying to every corner of the street. Schoolteacher and correspondent for the Territorial Express. I've been documenting this entire incident, including the marshal's questionable choice of targets during what should have been a clear-cut case of law enforcement. The leader of the attackers seemed to realize that the situation had turned decisively against them, with the arrival of witnesses who couldn't be easily silenced or intimidated. Public attention was the last thing their operation needed, and witnesses with notebooks were particularly dangerous in a territory where newspaper reports could bring federal investigators asking uncomfortable questions. He fired one final shot at Hyamovi, missing by mere inches, then spurred his horse toward the edge of town with the desperate urgency of a man who understood that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. His surviving companions followed in retreat, all of them disappearing into the heat shimmer of the prairie like mirages dissolving in the afternoon sun. As the dust settled and the echoes of gunfire faded, Ruth noticed a small face peering out from beneath a canvas-covered wagon. A stable boy about 12 years old with dirt-streaked cheeks and eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from witnessing violence too often in a place where it had become commonplace. He caught her attention and gestured frantically, his voice barely above a whisper, as he fought against terror to share crucial information. "I seen them yesterday morning, watched them load your folks into that RMK wagon. Your ma was crying something fierce, and the little ones looked scared as rabbits. But they was all breathing when they drove off toward the mine road." Ruth's heart leaped with the first real hope she'd felt since this nightmare began. Hope mixed with desperate gratitude for this boy's courage in speaking truth despite the obvious danger it represented. Her family was alive, or at least had been when this boy witnessed their transportation. That single fact was enough to kindle the flame of determination that had been smoldering in her chest since the moment she'd crawled from that root cellar. Boone holstered his weapon with obvious reluctance, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment at being so publicly challenged by a woman with a notebook and the authority to use it effectively. The presence of witnesses and documentation had transformed what should have been a simple intimidation into a potential scandal that could reach territorial authorities. "You folks didn't see anything here except a misunderstanding that got out of hand," he declared, with the tone of a man accustomed to having his version of reality accepted without question or investigation. On the contrary. Miriam Shaw interrupted, her pencil moving rapidly across the notebook's pages with the efficiency of someone accustomed to recording truth under difficult circumstances. "I observed 3 armed men attack a child and her protector without provocation. I witnessed clear evidence of premeditated assault. And I documented the local marshal drawing his weapon on the wrong participants in what should have been an open and shut case of criminal violence." She closed her notebook with a decisive snap that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the tense silence that had settled over the street like dust after a storm. "The question, Marshal Boone, is what you intend to do about enforcing actual justice in this situation, or whether higher authorities need to be informed about your performance of duty." Ruth stepped forward, her young voice carrying clearly across the dusty street despite her age and the magnitude of what she was challenging. "Those men kidnapped my family. That boy over there saw it happen with his own eyes. Are you going to help us find them and bring them to justice, or do we have to handle this ourselves?" A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd as townspeople waited to see how their elected representative of law and order would respond to such a direct challenge from a 13-year-old girl who had just survived a gun battle in the middle of their supposedly civilized community. Boone looked around at the watching faces, clearly calculating the political costs of his next move against the financial benefits of maintaining his current arrangements. Finally, he spat into the dust and adjusted his hat with the air of a man making the best of a situation that had spiraled beyond his control. "I'll look into it," he said grudgingly, the words forced from him like teeth being pulled. "But don't expect miracles, girl. This is dangerous country, and sometimes people just disappear without a trace, especially when they go poking their noses into business that doesn't concern them." The threat in his words was unmistakable, but Ruth refused to be intimidated by a man who had shown his true colors in front of half the town. Her family was alive, and that knowledge was all the fuel she needed to keep fighting against whatever forces had torn them apart. Miriam Shaw approached them as the crowd began to disperse, her sharp eyes taking in details that others might miss, cataloging information with the precision of someone trained to observe and remember. Ruth noticed something about the woman's precise manner, or the way her fingers unconsciously traced the edge of an antique pocket watch chain that hung from her vest, a delicate piece that seemed oddly elegant for a frontier schoolteacher. "You'll need help," Miriam said without preamble, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge of difficult situations. The Silver Spur Mine isn't just another business operation. It's the center of a web of corruption that reaches into every corner of this county like poison in a well. Ruth studied this unexpected ally who had materialized at their moment of greatest need, her instincts sharpened by recent experiences, warning her to question everyone's motives until proven otherwise. "Why would you help us for just a moment?" Something flickered in Miriam's composed expression. A flash of pain so intense it made Ruth take a step back, followed immediately by barely controlled rage that transformed the schoolteacher's face into something harder and more dangerous. The woman's hand moved instinctively to her pocket watch, and Ruth caught a glimpse of emotions held in check by years of iron self-control before the professional mask slipped back into place. "Because I've been investigating McKinn's operation for months," Miriam said carefully, her words chosen with the precision of someone walking through a minefield of truth and deception. "Your family's situation might be exactly what I need to expose the truth and bring some real justice to this territory before more innocent people suffer." That afternoon, in the relative privacy of Miriam's schoolhouse at the edge of town, they spread out detailed maps and shared information that painted a picture far darker than Ruth had imagined possible. McKinn's corruption wasn't just about land fraud or even murder for profit. It was a systematic network that turned human misery into gold through methods that would have made medieval tyrants proud of their restraint. McKinn identifies struggling homesteads and creates artificial debts through trumped-up legal charges. Miriam explained, pointing to marked locations on her carefully annotated map that showed the scope of the operation with frightening clarity. When families can't pay impossible amounts calculated to be beyond their reach, he seizes their property through legal mechanisms that look legitimate on paper but are fundamentally corrupt in practice. When she spoke McKinn's name, Ruth noticed her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, and her free hand once again found that pocket watch with movements that suggested long habit and deeper significance than mere nervous fidgeting. "What happens to the families?" Ruth asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "The men who might cause trouble either die in convenient accidents or disappear entirely. The women and children." Miriam's voice trailed off, and Ruth saw something terrible flicker in her eyes. "Some are kept as forced laborers. Others are sold to interests that prefer not to be named. The lucky ones simply die quickly." The implications hit Ruth like a physical blow, making her stomach clench with terror for what her family might already be enduring. "Is Papa dead?" "I pray not, child. But men who take work as powder men at McKinn's operation have a way of dying in explosions that always seem to happen just when they're about to ask too many questions or demand better treatment." As evening approached, they finalized their desperate plan with the thoroughness of military strategists preparing for a battle that would determine the fate of everything they held dear. Miriam would approach the mine openly the following day, using her credentials as a territorial school inspector to demand access to any children on the property, a legal requirement that even McKinn couldn't openly ignore without attracting unwanted attention. While she kept the guards distracted with official business and bureaucratic demands, Ruth and Hyamovi would infiltrate the compound from behind, searching for both evidence of systematic crimes and the prisoners who represented the human cost of McKinn's greed. Remember, Miriam warned, her expression grave. With professional knowledge of what they were facing, McKinn isn't just greedy. He's intelligent, ruthless, and completely without conscience. If he suspects we're there for any reason other than routine inspection, he won't hesitate to kill us all and dispose of the bodies where they'll never be found. But as they prepared for what might be their final night before attempting the rescue, Ruth began noticing small details that didn't quite fit the picture Miriam had painted of herself. The woman asked very specific questions about their exact plans, seemed unusually interested in their precise timing, and demonstrated knowledge of the mine's layout that went beyond what any teacher should reasonably possess through casual investigation. Most telling of all was the way Miriam's hand kept returning to that pocket watch, and the expression that crossed her face when she thought no one was looking. Not the detached concern of a professional investigator, but the burning intensity of someone with a very personal stake in McKinn's destruction. Ruth caught Hyamovi's eye and saw her own growing suspicions reflected in his dark gaze. Was their newfound ally truly what she appeared to be? Or was she playing a more complex and dangerous game that might cost them everything they were trying to save? The answer would reveal itself tomorrow, when everything they had planned would face the ultimate test of reality, and all their lives would hang in the balance of choices made in fire and blood. The Silver Spur mine crouched against the base of Copper Mesa, like a festering wound in the earth, surrounded by coils of barbed wire, and watched by armed sentries whose rifles caught the morning sunlight with deadly promise. From their hiding place among weathered rocks half a mile distant, Ruth could see smoke rising from multiple chimneys and hear the constant mechanical rhythm of the stamp mill crushing ore into profitable dust, along with the occasional rumble of underground blasting that shook the ground beneath their feet. The mine complex was larger than Ruth had expected, sprawling across several acres, with buildings that served different functions in McKinn's operation. The main shaft entrance yawned like the mouth of hell itself, while smaller structures housed equipment supplies and what appeared to be living quarters for workers or prisoners, depending on one's perspective on the nature of employment at the Silver Spur. The building where prisoners were most likely held resembled a military stockade more than workers' quarters, thick timber walls with small windows set too high for easy escape. A single reinforced door, flanked by guards who looked more like soldiers than miners. Somewhere behind those walls, her family waited for a rescue that might never come, none enduring whatever horrors McKinn had devised for those who crossed his path. There, Hyamovi whispered, pointing toward a drainage ditch that meandered along the compound's eastern perimeter like a scar in the earth. We can approach without being seen until we reach the outer fence. From there, he shrugged with the fatalistic acceptance of a warrior who understood that some battles required more courage than strategy. They waited, hearts pounding like war drums, until they spotted Miriam Shaw's buckboard approaching the main gate in the distance. Her official credentials and demanding manner already drawing the attention of guards who clearly weren't accustomed to dealing with territorial authorities who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Then began their treacherous descent toward the compound, using every scrap of cover the landscape offered, while moving with the patience of hunters who understood that a single mistake would mean death for everyone they were trying to save. The drainage ditch proved deeper than expected and filled with stagnant water that reeked of industrial chemicals, human waste, and things better left unidentified. But it provided the concealment they desperately needed to approach the perimeter undetected. Through the corrugated metal pipe that carried the ditch beneath the perimeter fence, they could hear Miriam's voice, raised in bureaucratic authority, with the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to having official demands met without question or delay. I have a territorial mandate to inspect the educational status and welfare of all minors in this district, and I will not be denied access by any corporate interest regardless of their political connections. Her confrontation with the guards bought them precious minutes to crawl through the foul-smelling pipe and emerge inside the compound proper, their clothes now soaked with substances that made them grateful for the concealing darkness. Ruth's dress was beyond recognition, but she had never cared less about her appearance, every fiber of her being focused on the fortified building ahead where her family might be imprisoned. When the guards turned away to deal with Miriam's increasingly heated demands for compliance with territorial law, Ruth and Hyamovi sprinted across 30 yards of open ground in a desperate low crouch, reaching the shadow of the prisoner quarters without detection. Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird as she realized they had actually made it inside McKinn's stronghold without being shot down like rabid dogs. Hyamovi lifted Ruth to peer through the first high window, and her heart nearly exploded with relief and anguish at what she saw inside. Her family was there. Mama Bess and Eli huddled together on filthy straw in what was unmistakably a prison cell designed for long-term confinement rather than temporary holding. Leah's dress was torn and stained with substances Ruth didn't want to identify, her usually immaculate hair hanging in tangled strands around her face like a wild woman's. Bess and Eli clung to their mother's sides like drowning children, their young faces hollow with fear, hunger, and the kind of trauma that left permanent scars on developing minds. But they were alive. They were together. And they were close enough to touch, if only she could find a way through these cursed walls that seemed designed to keep hope trapped as surely as they contained human beings. The door is secured from the outside with iron bars and multiple locks. Hyamovi observed grimly, after his examination of the building's perimeter revealed the thoroughness of McKinn's security measures. We would need tools and time we don't possess, plus luck we have no reason to expect. A cultured voice suddenly interrupted their desperate planning, coming from far too close, and speaking with the casual authority of someone completely in control of the situation. Well, well, well. What an absolutely fascinating development we have here. Ruth spun around to see a tall, well-dressed man in an expensive suit that would have looked more appropriate in Denver or San Francisco than in this industrial hell. He was flanked by 2 guards, carrying rifles with the practiced ease of men who killed for wages, and his pale eyes seemed to calculate the value of everything they examined with the cold precision of a banker foreclosing on a widow's farm. Randall McKinn. Ruth recognized him instantly, with the instinctive certainty of prey, identifying its predator, the spider at the center of the web that had destroyed so many lives, the architect of misery who treated human beings like livestock, to be bought, sold, and discarded when they outlived their usefulness or became inconvenient to maintain. Miss Shaw's educational inspection seems to have attracted some rather unexpected visitors. McKinn observed with the casual tone of a man discussing the weather rather than contemplating multiple murders. How utterly fascinating to discover the depths of territorial government efficiency in tracking down educational violations. Ruth stepped out from behind Hyamovi, meeting McKinn's calculating stare without flinching, despite every instinct screaming at her to run as fast as her legs would carry her. I've come for my family. McKinn's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise before his expression transformed into the delighted amusement of a connoisseur encountering an unexpected vintage. Thomas Lark's daughter, of course, the little wildcat who escaped from my associates the other night and caused such an inconvenient commotion. You've led us quite a chase, young lady. Before Ruth could respond, one of the guards struck Hyamovi in the skull with his rifle butt, dropping the warrior to his knees, with blood immediately streaming from the wound. The other guard seized Ruth's arms, pinning them behind her back, with enough force to make her gasp in pain, while reminding her how utterly powerless she was in this place, where McKinn's word was the only law that mattered. "Bring them both," McKinn commanded with the authority of a man accustomed to absolute obedience from everyone within his sphere of influence. "I believe it's time for a long-overdue family reunion that should prove educational for all concerned." They were marched across the compound toward the mine entrance, a gaping maw in the mountainside that seemed to breathe darkness and despair into the afternoon air with each gust of wind that emerged from its depths. The opening looked less like the entrance to a workplace than the throat of some enormous predator, waiting patiently to swallow them whole and digest their bones at leisure. At the threshold between sunlight and eternal darkness, McKinn cupped his hands around his mouth and called into the echoing depths with theatrical flourish. Thomas Lark, you have some very special visitors who've traveled quite a distance to see you." The sound of his voice died away into the tunnels, replaced by the shuffle of reluctant footsteps from deep within the mountain's belly, accompanied by the clanking of chains that spoke of imprisonment more complete than any cage. A figure gradually emerged from the shadows, stumbling slightly, as his eyes adjusted to the harsh sunlight after days or weeks in artificial darkness. Ruth's heart shattered at the sight of her father, and she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out in anguish. Thomas Lark had aged a decade in the 8 days since she'd last seen him, his clothes hanging in filthy rags that barely qualified as human garments, his face gaunt with malnutrition and exhaustion that spoke of systematic abuse designed to break his spirit along with his body. Shackles bound his ankles with chains that forced him to take short, humiliating steps like a dancing bear in some grotesque circus performance. His hands were black with coal dust and streaked with what looked suspiciously like dried blood evidence of whatever tortures McKinn had devised for those who dared to question his authority or demand basic human treatment. But when his eyes found her face, they blazed with desperate joy that transcended his physical degradation. Love stronger than any chain McKinn could devise, burning bright enough to illuminate the darkness that had consumed his world. "Ruth, dear God in heaven, you're alive." He tried to run to her, but immediately stumbled on his chains, crashing hard to the rocky ground in a display of helplessness that brought tears to her eyes. A guard yanked him upright with casual brutality, treating him like an animal that existed solely for their amusement. "Papa." Ruth fought against her captor's iron grip, with renewed fury born of seeing her father reduced to this state. But the man was easily twice her size, and strength making her struggles as futile as a butterfly trying to break steel cables. McKinn watched their reunion with obvious satisfaction, like a connoisseur appreciating a particularly fine vintage of human suffering that had been aged to perfection in the cellars of despair. Nothing quite compares to the love between father and daughter, does it? He observed with false sentimentality that made his words even more obscene. Such a beautiful, tragic thing to witness. Unfortunately, it's also about to become quite fatal for all concerned. His voice turned cold as winter steel, revealing the reptilian nature beneath his civilized veneer. "Your father has been extraordinarily helpful in expanding our operations, haven't you, Thomas? It's truly remarkable what a man will do when his family's lives hang by the thinnest of threads." Thomas raised his head with effort that spoke of injuries both visible and hidden, and Ruth saw something she had never witnessed before. In her father's weathered features, shame so deep and terrible, it seemed to cut deeper than any physical wound could manage, eating away at his soul like acid. "I'm so sorry, Ruth," he whispered, his voice breaking like glass ground beneath a boot heel. "I helped them forge property deeds, assisted in planning raids against other innocent families. I told myself it was all to protect you and your mother and the little ones. But the truth is..." His voice failed entirely for a moment before he forced himself to continue. "The truth is that I became part of the very evil I should have been fighting against with my last breath." Ruth stared at her father, struggling to process this devastating revelation that shattered her image of him as the moral center of their family universe. Papa, her hero, the man who had taught her the difference between right and wrong, he had participated in destroying other families like their own. The exquisite beauty of the arrangement. McKinn continued, clearly savoring every moment of their emotional torment, like a fine wine to be sipped slowly. Is that Thomas is now legally complicit in enough felonies to hang him 3 times over. Even if he somehow managed to escape this place, he would never dare testify against my operations without simultaneously condemning himself to the gallows. From somewhere behind them came the sharp crack of rifle fire, followed by raised voices and the sound of running feet. Miriam's carefully orchestrated distraction had apparently reached its explosive climax, drawing guards away from their posts as they dealt with whatever crisis she had managed to create at the main gate. McKinn's expression darkened with annoyance at this interruption to his theatrical moment. Speaking of tiresome complications that require immediate resolution, bring them all inside where we can conclude this business properly and permanently, away from prying eyes and unwanted witnesses. As they were pushed toward the mine entrance, Ruth caught Hayamovi's eye and saw that despite his head wound and the blood trickling down his face, his gaze remained alert and calculating, with the predatory focus of a warrior waiting for the right moment to transform their desperate situation into an opportunity for justice, no matter how slim the odds might appear. The descent into the mine felt like a journey straight into hell itself, each step taking them further from the light and hope of the surface world. Narrow passages stretched into darkness that seemed to swallow their footsteps, filled with the acrid smell of dynamite, human sweat and despair so thick it seemed to coat the walls like fungus. Support timbers groaned ominously under the weight of countless tons of rock overhead, their protests echoing through the tunnels like the voices of tortured spirits warning intruders away from this place, where humanity had been abandoned in favor of profit. The air grew thinner and more poisonous, with each step deeper into the earth's bowels, making breathing difficult and thought sluggish. Oil lamps mounted on the tunnel walls created pools of flickering light, separated by stretches of absolute darkness, their flames dancing in air currents that spoke of vast spaces and hidden chambers, where terrible things might wait beyond the reach of illumination. The sound of dripping water echoed from unseen sources, suggesting underground streams, or perhaps something more sinister. The main chamber opened into a vast cathedral of shadows, supported by massive wooden beams that disappeared into the darkness above, like the pillars of some pagan temple dedicated to gods who demanded blood sacrifice. Ruth counted at least 15 armed men scattered throughout the space, all of them watching their prisoners with the casual interest of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. In the flickering lamplight beyond the main work area, she could make out other figures, more prisoners, perhaps 24 men and women, who looked as broken and hopeless as her father. Some wore the remnants of farming clothes that spoke of lives stolen from honest labor. Others the simple dresses of homesteaders' wives who had committed no crime except owning land that McKinn coveted. All bore the hollow-eyed expression of people who had abandoned any hope of rescue or redemption, and their spirits crushed by whatever horrors they had endured in service to McKinn's greed. They watched the new arrivals with the disinterest of those who had seen too much suffering to care about additional victims joining their ranks in hell. "The welcome to the true heart of my operation," McKinn announced with obvious pride, his voice echoing off the stone walls like the pronouncement of a king in his throne room. "This is where inconvenient questions come to die, and where justice becomes whatever I decide it should be on any given day." But McKinn's plan was far more diabolical than Ruth had imagined possible, revealing a mind that found pleasure in elaborate cruelty rather than simple efficiency. Instead of simply executing them or collapsing the main chamber to bury the evidence, he led them deeper into the mine complex, through passages that grew narrower and less stable with each turn. They emerged into a smaller chamber that showed ominous cracks in the ceiling from recent blasting, with water seeping through the damaged rock in steady streams that pooled on the uneven floor. The air here was thick with moisture, and the smell of impending structural failure suggesting that this section of the mine was on the verge of collapse. Your family is being held in the old shaft." McKinn announced with theatrical cruelty that transformed simple murder into performance art, pointing toward a narrow passage that disappeared into darkness deeper than any Ruth had yet experienced. Unfortunately, that particular section has been scheduled for demolition as part of our ongoing safety improvements. He gestured to his men, who began hauling forward wooden crates filled with dynamite. But these weren't the simple bombs Ruth had expected from her father's stories about mining work. Instead, they were complex timing devices with multiple fuses, mechanical triggers, and what appeared to be electrical components that spoke of sophisticated planning and professional expertise. The storm that's building outside has been quite helpful to our purposes. McKinn continued as the first drops of rain began falling through cracks in the ceiling, pooling on the floor, and making everything treacherously slippery. The water will ensure that when this section collapses, it stays collapsed. Your family will be buried so deep they'll never be found even by searchers with the best intentions and unlimited time. Thomas, despite his shackles and obvious injuries, stepped forward with the authority of someone who understood explosives with professional intimacy. "You're using a pressure trigger system combined with timer fuses," he said, his voice carrying the weight of knowledge earned through years of dangerous work. "Water-activated charges that will detonate when the flooding reaches a predetermined level. If the timer doesn't kill them, the secondary charges will when the water rises high enough to complete the electrical circuit." McKinn smiled with genuine admiration for technical expertise, even from a man he intended to kill. "Excellent analysis, Thomas. Your professional knowledge makes this so much more satisfying. You understand exactly how your loved ones are going to die, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to prevent it from happening." The mechanical ticking of the timer devices filled the chamber with metallic menace as water continued to seep through the damaged ceiling with increasing flow that promised the storm above was intensifying beyond their earlier expectations. Ruth could hear thunder rumbling through the mountain itself, and each lightning strike seemed to make the very rocks vibrate with transferred energy. 15 minutes. McKinn announced, after checking his pocket watch with theatrical precision that suggested he was timing this destruction for maximum psychological impact. Perhaps 20 if the water rises slowly and gives them time to contemplate their fate. Long enough for proper goodbyes and final reconciliations, but not nearly enough time for any heroic rescue attempts. That's when the sound of approaching boots echoed from the main tunnel, accompanied by voices raised in anger and the unmistakable crack of gunfire that spoke of serious combat rather than simple intimidation. Miriam Shaw appeared in the chamber entrance. But she was no longer alone and no longer playing the role of harmless schoolteacher. Behind her came armed men wearing badges that Ruth had never seen before. Federal marshals with the authority to act beyond the reach of local corruption, their weapons drawn, and their faces grim with the knowledge of what they had found in this place, where law and human decency had been abandoned. Federal marshals. One of them shouted with the voice of absolute authority. Everyone on the ground immediately. McKinn's face contorted with rage as he realized his carefully orchestrated plan was collapsing around him like a house built on sand, years of patient construction destroyed by forces he had never anticipated. "Kill them all," he screamed to his men with the desperation of a tyrant watching his empire crumble. "Kill them all and burn the evidence." The chamber erupted in gunfire as federal agents battled McKinn's private army in the confined space that turned every shot into potential death for combatants and prisoners alike. Muzzle flashes illuminated the underground cathedral in stroboscopic lightning while the crash of weapons echoed off stone walls with deafening intensity that made coordinated action nearly impossible. But Ruth wasn't watching the gun battle that raged around her. Her attention was fixed on the timer devices counting down to her family's death with mechanical precision that cared nothing for human courage or federal authority. In the chaos of combat, She broke free from her captors who were too busy fighting for their own lives to maintain control over prisoners. The narrow passage to the old shaft was a nightmare of darkness, rising water and unstable rock that groaned and shifted with each rumble of thunder from above. Ruth had to feel her way along walls that wept moisture and threatened to collapse at any moment, her heart pounding as she heard the mechanical ticking of the timing devices growing louder with each step, deeper into the mountain's bowels. Water was already ankle-deep in the tunnel, and rising steadily as the storm above fed torrents through every crack and fissure in the compromised mountain. The current tried to sweep her feet from under her, and loose rocks fell from the ceiling with increasing frequency, promising that total collapse was only a matter of time. She found them in a small chamber at the end of the tunnel. Leah holding Bess and Eli against the back wall, all three of them chained to iron rings driven into the solid rock. Water was rising around their feet with terrifying speed, and wooden crates of dynamite were stacked nearby, connected to an elaborate system of fuses and triggers that would ensure the chamber's complete destruction, along with everyone trapped inside. Ruth. Her mother sobbed, reaching toward her daughter with hands still bound by McKinn's chains. "How did you find us? How did you get through his guards?" "I'm getting you out of here," Ruth said, examining the timer device that showed less than 8 minutes remaining before detonation, while the rising water level approached the trigger point that would set off the secondary charges designed to guarantee no survivors. But Ruth had learned something during her father's lessons about mining and explosives during the long winter evenings when he'd shared stories about his dangerous work. Water could be an enemy that flooded mines and drowned workers, but it could also be an ally that disrupted electrical systems and rendered sophisticated mechanisms useless. Instead of trying to dismantle McKinn's complex system of timers and triggers, she began deliberately accelerating the flooding by breaking open ceiling supports that were already weakened by the storm. Using rocks and debris as tools, she channeled the growing torrent directly onto the electrical components of McKinn's elaborate death trap. "What are you doing?" Leah asked in terror as water and debris cascaded down in increasing volume. "Papa taught me that water can short-circuit electrical systems," Ruth explained, working frantically to direct the flood toward the timer mechanism while fighting against panic that threatened to paralyze her thinking. "If I can flood the detonation system faster than it can trigger, the electrical circuits will fail before they can set off the explosives." The gamble was absolutely insane. If she miscalculated the timing or underestimated the system's resilience, the rising water would drown them all before the explosives could be disabled. But if McKinn's system was as sophisticated as it appeared, the electronic components might fail when submerged, buying them the time needed for rescue. Water poured through the damaged ceiling as Ruth used every piece of debris she could find to channel the flood directly onto the timer devices and electrical connections. Sparks flew as the systems began shorting out in showers of blue fire, and the mechanical ticking grew erratic before stopping entirely with a final click that sounded like the closing of death's door. But the water continued rising with relentless determination, and Ruth realized with growing horror that she might have traded death by explosion for death by drowning. As the chamber filled rapidly toward the ceiling, the narrow tunnel back to the main mine was becoming impassable, as water levels rose beyond what any human could navigate, even with the strongest swimming skills and unlimited courage. That's when she heard Hayamovi's voice echoing through the flooded passage, calling her name, with the patient determination of someone who would never abandon allies, no matter what obstacles stood between them and salvation. The warrior had fought his way through the gun battle and was now wading through chest-deep water to reach them, following the sound of their voices through passages that grew more dangerous with each passing moment. "The ceiling is unstable," Ruth shouted back through the roar of rushing water. "The whole section could collapse if you put too much weight on the support beams. Then we leave now before it gets worse," Hayamovi replied with the absolute calm of someone who had faced death so many times that additional threats held no power to disturb his equilibrium. "Can your family swim well enough to make it through the flooded passages?" Getting Leah, Bess, and Eli through the flooded tunnel in absolute darkness was the most terrifying experience of Ruth's young life, requiring every ounce of courage and determination she possessed. The water was over their heads, in places where the tunnel dipped below the flood level, and the current kept trying to sweep them towards side passages that led nowhere except deeper into the mountain's maze. Bess panicked halfway through when water closed over her head, in a section where the ceiling had partially collapsed and had to be carried by Hayamovi, while Ruth guided her mother and little brother through the black water that seemed determined to claim additional victims for the mountain's hunger. Every breath was precious, every moment of air a gift that might not be repeated. They emerged into the main chamber to find the gun battle winding down with federal victory, though the cost had been high. Several of McKinn's men lay dead or wounded among the mining equipment, while others had surrendered to federal marshals who had proven more professional and better prepared than the corrupt local forces they had replaced. But McKinn himself was nowhere to be seen. He had apparently escaped during the chaos, slipping away through passages he knew better than anyone, while his men died defending an operation he had already abandoned like a rat, leaving a sinking ship. Thomas was free of his shackles and helping other prisoners evacuate as the mine began showing serious signs of structural failure. The combination of flooding from above and McKinn's explosive preparations had weakened critical support beams throughout the complex, and the entire underground facility was threatening to collapse into rubble that would bury all evidence of the crimes committed in its depths. "Where's McKinn?" Ruth gasped as they reached relative safety, her lungs burning from the exertion of swimming through flooded passages while fighting panic every step of the way. "Gork, gone." One of the federal marshals replied grimly, his expression speaking of frustration at seeing the architect of so much suffering escape justice once again. "Slipped out through a back tunnel during the fighting. Could be anywhere in the territory by now." But Miriam Shaw had a different expression entirely. Not the disappointment of someone whose quarry had escaped, but the grim satisfaction of a hunter whose trap had finally been sprung after years of patient preparation. She was standing near the mine entrance, and Ruth noticed that she was no longer holding her notebook and pencil. Instead, her hand rested on something else entirely, that antique pocket watch that seemed to catch the lamplight with special significance, its golden surface reflecting flames like a mirror of memories too painful to examine directly. "He didn't escape," Miriam said quietly, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had planned this moment down to the smallest detail. "Not this time. Not after 15 years of waiting for the perfect opportunity." As if summoned by her words, the sound of a single gunshot echoed from somewhere deep in the mine complex, followed immediately by the rumble of collapsing timber and the rush of water finding new passages through broken rock that would carry away evidence and bodies alike. The back tunnel was rigged to collapse. Miriam explained with cold satisfaction that spoke of revenge long deferred but finally achieved. "I've been planning this particular moment for 15 years, ever since Randall McKinn murdered my father and made it look like a mining accident that no one would investigate too closely." Ruth stared at her with growing understanding of the forces that had brought them all together in this place of death and revelation. "Your father?" Miriam's professional mask finally cracked completely, revealing years of buried rage and grief that had been transformed into patient purpose through sheer force of will. "Jonathan Shaw, correspondent for the Denver Post. He came here to investigate McKinn's operation 15 years ago and was killed for asking the right questions to the wrong people. They said it was an accident, a tunnel collapse during his mine tour that could have happened to anyone. But I knew better." She held up the pocket watch, its golden surface engraved with initials that caught the light like captured sunbeams. "This was his. I've carried it every day for 15 years, waiting for the chance to make McKinn pay for what he did to my family, just as you fought to save yours from the same fate." The truth hit Ruth like a physical blow, rearranging everything she thought she understood about their unlikely alliance and the forces that had brought them together. Miriam hadn't just been investigating McKinn's operation as a matter of professional duty. She had been orchestrating his destruction with the patience of someone who understood that justice sometimes required a lifetime of preparation and the willingness to sacrifice everything for a single moment of perfect revenge. "Think you used us?" Ruth said, though, without anger, because she finally understood the depth of planning and personal cost that had made their rescue possible. "I gave you the chance to save your family while I settled a debt that was 15 years overdue." Miriam replied with the honesty of someone who no longer needed to hide her true motives. Sometimes, that's exactly how justice works in this imperfect world. Different people fighting the same enemy for different reasons, all of us stronger together than we could ever hope to be alone. The sound of collapsing tunnels continued to echo from deep within the mountain. As they evacuated the last of the prisoners, McKinn's empire literally crumbling around his corpse in a tomb of rock and water that would ensure his crimes were paid for in full. The man who had turned human misery into gold had finally met an accounting that no amount of money could escape. 2 weeks later, the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne was packed beyond capacity for the hearing that would determine the fate of Marshal Boone and the remaining members of McKinn's corrupt network. Federal Judge Marcus Whitman had traveled from Denver specifically to oversee these proceedings, bringing with him the full weight of territorial law and a reputation for absolute integrity that made him the perfect choice for such a consequential case. The courthouse itself was a magnificent building of red brick and carved stone, designed to project federal authority into a region where such authority often existed more in theory than practice. Its massive columns and soaring windows spoke of permanence and justice that transcended the temporary corruption of local officials, while its packed gallery demonstrated that the people of the territory were hungry for real accountability. Ruth's testimony was clear and devastating, delivered with the poise of someone who had faced far worse trials than cross-examination, and emerged stronger for the experience. She recounted every detail of their ordeal with precision that left no room for doubt about the systematic nature of McKinn's crimes or the complicity of those who had enabled them through action and inaction alike. The other rescued prisoners provided their own accounts of forced labor-staged accidents and deliberate intimidation that painted a comprehensive picture of corruption that had infected every level of local government and business. Their stories formed a chorus of injustice that filled the courtroom with palpable outrage at the scope of suffering that had been inflicted for profit. But the most dramatic moment came when Boone himself tried to flee during cross-examination, apparently hoping to escape before final judgment could be rendered. He had been growing increasingly agitated as the evidence mounted against him, sweating profusely and casting desperate glances toward the exits like a trapped animal seeking any avenue of escape. When the federal prosecutor produced a letter written in Boone's own hand, promising McKinn that troublesome witnesses would be handled with maximum efficiency and minimum publicity, the corrupt marshal's composure finally shattered completely, like glass under pressure. In a moment of pure panic, he suddenly leaped from the witness stand and bolted toward the courtroom's main exit with the desperate speed of a man who understood that his only remaining choice was between prison and the gallows. His flight lasted exactly 3 steps before federal marshals tackled him to the polished wooden floor in front of dozens of witnesses, his struggles only serving to demonstrate his guilt more clearly than any testimony could have managed. Judge Whitman's final verdict was comprehensive and decisive, delivered with the authority of someone who understood that justice delayed was justice denied. Boone received 25 years in federal prison for corruption, conspiracy, and accessory to kidnapping and murder. His deputies received sentences proportional to their cooperation with the investigation, ranging from 5 years for those who provided crucial testimony to 15 years for those who remained loyal to their corrupt leader. Most importantly, for the future of the territory, McKinn's extensive estate was seized under federal law to provide compensation to his numerous victims, while the court ordered a complete reorganization of territorial law enforcement with permanent federal oversight to prevent similar corruption from taking root in the fertile soil of frontier lawlessness. As the hearing concluded with justice finally served, Ruth felt a profound mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion that comes from seeing a long struggle reach its proper conclusion. The legal system had worked as intended, but the cost in human suffering had been enormous, and the scars would take years to heal completely. Outside the courthouse, she found Hyamovi, waiting beside his horse in the golden light of late afternoon, holding a small wooden carving in his weathered hands, with the reverence of someone presenting a sacred gift. The sculpture depicted an eagle in magnificent flight, its wings spread wide against invisible currents of air that would carry it to heights beyond human imagination. "For you," he said, simply offering the carefully crafted gift with the gravity of someone passing on wisdom earned through suffering. "To remind you that even when everything seems lost, when the ground itself disappears beneath your feet and darkness threatens to swallow hope itself, the spirit can still rise above any earthly limitation that men might devise." Ruth accepted the carving with tears beginning to blur her vision, understanding that this moment represented more than simple farewell. It was the completion of a bond forged in fire and tested by trials that had revealed the best in both of them. "Will our paths cross again someday?" she asked, her voice small against the vastness of separation that stretched ahead. Hyamovi's smile carried both gentleness and an edge of sadness that spoke of too many farewells over the years, too many partings from people who had touched his life in ways that mattered. "The world is vast beyond imagining, little sister, but I have learned through long experience that the paths of truly honorable people have a mysterious way of crossing again when they are most needed by forces larger than our individual understanding." He mounted his horse with the fluid grace of someone born to the saddle and rode toward the western mountains that stretched endlessly toward the setting sun, leaving Ruth with the profound knowledge that some friendships transcend every boundary of race, age, culture, and circumstance. The warrior had kept his sacred promise at great personal risk, and in doing so had taught her that honor was not merely a word spoken in comfortable moments, but a way of living that demanded everything while offering even more in return. That evening, the Lark family returned to their rebuilt homestead, using compensation money provided by the federal seizure of McKinn's assets. The new cabin was smaller than their original home, but felt like a palace after everything they had endured together, each room filled with the precious sound of voices reunited and love restored. More importantly, it stood on land that was now legally and permanently theirs beyond any question or challenge, the original deed having been recovered from its hiding place behind the photograph in Thomas's desperate attempt to protect their most precious possession from those who would steal it through fraud and violence. Ruth stood in the doorway as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson that spoke of endings and new beginnings, looking out at prairie grassland that had once seemed threatening, but now represented infinite possibility stretching to every horizon. The wind whispered through grass that bent gracefully before each gust, but never broke, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of seasons yet to come. On the mantel above their fireplace sat two items that told the complete story of her transformation from victim to survivor to champion of justice for those who had no other voice. The family photograph, its cracks now mended with threads of gold that made it more beautiful than it had ever been in its original perfection, smiled down at them with faces full of love that had proven stronger than violence, separation, or despair. Beside it rested the original land deed that had been hidden so cleverly, providing the legal foundation for reclaiming everything they had nearly lost to systematic greed and corruption. Together, these two documents represented the true victory, not just survival, but the preservation of family bonds and legal rights that no amount of money or violence could ultimately destroy. As night settled over their reclaimed home with a gentle peace of justice finally achieved, Ruth helped her mother prepare supper, while Bess and Eli played beside the crackling fire, their laughter more precious than any treasure that had ever been mined from the earth's depths. Their voices rose and fell with the comfortable rhythm of family life restored, creating a symphony of normalcy that had seemed impossible only weeks before. Outside, Thomas worked contentedly in the rebuilt barn, humming an old hymn as he tended their few animals with hands that had learned to create rather than destroy. His shame was gradually giving way to determination to make amends through better choices and active participation in building a more just society, where families like theirs would never again face such trials alone. They had lost much during their ordeal, innocence certainly, and the comfortable security of believing that the world was fundamentally fair to those who worked hard and lived honest lives. But they had gained something far more valuable: absolute knowledge, that they possessed strength beyond their wildest imagination, that love could triumph over even the most systematic evil, and that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when justice itself hung in the balance. Ruth picked up Hayamovi's eagle carving and held it toward the lamplight, admiring the incredible skill with which he had captured the bird's fierce grace and unconquerable spirit in wood that would outlast the memory of those who had tried to crush it. The sculptures seemed to embody everything she had learned about rising above circumstances that seemed impossible to overcome. Tomorrow would undoubtedly bring new challenges, the slow, patient work of healing from trauma that would take years to complete fully, the constant vigilance required to protect what they had fought so hard to build, and preserve the ongoing struggle to create a truly just society in a world that often rewarded cruelty over compassion. But tonight, she was simply a 13-year-old girl surrounded by the people she loved most in all the world, safe and warm in a home they had literally fought to defend and won the legal right to keep forever. The photograph smiled down at them from its place of honor, its golden scars serving as a permanent reminder that some things actually become more valuable after they have been broken and then carefully, lovingly mended by hands that refuse to accept defeat. Outside their windows, the prairie wind whispered ancient secrets through the endless grass, carrying with it the eternal promise that dawn would come again, as it always had and always would, bringing hope to those brave enough to keep fighting for it against all odds. The frightened child who had sobbed alone in a burning cabin was gone forever, replaced by a young woman who understood with perfect clarity that justice was not something that simply happened to people in fairy tales. It was something that people made happen through their own choices, a decision at a time, one stand at a time, one act of courage at a time. Ruth extinguished the lamp and joined her family beside their fire, where stories were being told and plans were being made for a future that stretched ahead like an unwritten book full of infinite possibilities waiting to be discovered. Above them, the vast Wyoming sky reached from horizon to horizon, filled with stars that had witnessed countless human struggles and triumphs. All of them part of the endless story of people who refused to surrender their dreams to those who would crush them beneath the wheels of greed and violence. The eagle soared free in her imagination and in the carved wood she held, and Ruth Lark slept peacefully beneath the boundless heavens, dreaming of all the heights she had yet to reach and all the battles for justice she had yet to fight, in a world that desperately needed people willing to stand up for what was right, no matter the personal cost or the odds against success.